Um, my name is Jacob Witzell, and I have been a PhD student in the Mistra SAMS project for the last years. Now I'm an actual researcher, so to say, since 1 or 2 weeks back. I'm going to talk today about 2 articles in my thesis, which regards the handling of transport efficiency measures in Swedish national transport planning. And I will get into that soon, what that means. But this is the title of my thesis, Approaching Transformative Futures, Discourse and Practice in Swedish National Transport Policy and Planning. And I think that I perhaps should have put or added a question mark to the thesis title, which I didn't do, and I was criticized for during my presentation of my work 2 weeks ago, because perhaps it's a too positive title in some critics' view, but we'll see. The background to today's presentation is that Mistra SAMS, as I think you know, is a research program which is concerned with digitally based accessibility solutions in society, which should contribute to mitigating climate emissions in a socially just way. Still, dissemination of digitally supported accessibility depends on other planning processes in society. For example, on how possibilities of behavioral change and, for example, effects on future travel demand are understood in national transport policy and planning processes. And during my PhD research, I have studied how future uncertainty, which permeates transport planning, and uncertainty on transport efficient solutions and the agency of planning related to this are considered in national transport planning. So in this talk today, I will focus on 2 planning processes in particular, which were carried out in the recent years and reflect upon a currently ongoing revision of the National Investment Plan in relation to this. Transport efficient society, then, is a concept which is commonly used when talking about climate mitigation in the transport system in Sweden. Climate mitigation in transport is generally considered to require 3 categories of measures: more energy efficient vehicles, fossil-free fuels, but also then increased transport efficiency. And this last part then on transport efficiency mirrors the opportunities in society to proactively affect travel demand. For example, decrease expected future increases in travel. And transport efficiency as a concept is emphasized in national policy documents from the government and parliament, but also planning agencies like the Swedish Transport Administration, the Swedish Energy Agency, for example. There is no unitary definition of transport efficiency, but usually it is understood to regard economic and informative policy measures affecting travel demand, land use planning and integration of transport and land use planning, localization of housing and services in order to decrease travel demand and shorten distances between workplaces, housing and services, for example. And the concept then reflects an aim to decrease the need to travel, so to say, and shift to less polluting modes of travel, from car to walking, biking, and public transport, for example, and utilizing the capacity of current vehicles better, for example, traveling together or increasing the efficiency of goods transport. In the 2 research articles that I will talk about today, I have been studying how knowledge perspectives and methods of analysis or planning practices affect the exploration and consideration of future development pathways in national transport planning. I have applied a social constructivist approach, which simply means that knowledge and the methods which construct knowledge, for example, planning practices, are specifics for a certain time and place. And planning can be understood in this sense as characterized by conflicts over what is considered relevant knowledge, true knowledge, and what is realistic knowledge, when we consider uncertain futures. I have been carrying out content analysis of many planning documents and planning instructions from the government, and carried out interviews with involved planners in Swedish planning agencies. I will then talk about two studies and then make a comparison at the end. The first study then is of the National Transport Infrastructure Investment Plan for the period 2018 to 2029, which is the currently legal plan for how to invest in the transport system at the national level in Sweden. And I will talk about how dominant practices and knowledge perspectives in this planning process have limited thought on the possibilities of affecting future travel demand. Central to national transport planning is the so-called national base forecast of future travel demand. Normally, only one single forecast of future national travel demand is prepared in national transport planning. It is based on a combination of historic statistical cause-effect relationships of what affects travel demand and assumptions of how certain variables which affect travel demand will develop in years ahead. And among important variables are macroeconomic and demographic variables like population growth, the development of real income, employment rate, the driving cost for car, the number of cars per capita, that is car ownership, the infrastructure network, which roads and railways are available, and the frequency of bus and train services. And a specific limitation in Sweden in the recent decade has been that the forecast should only consider already decided policy. That is, only the political decisions that has already been taken, not, for example, future tax reforms or economic policy, which could affect travel demand. And thereby, this base forecast has a predictive character, but it is also conservative in the sense that it doesn't explore future possibilities of affecting travel demand. Rather, it reflects the current situation. And car travel is generally forecasted to increase quite strongly. For example, by 25% between 2010 and 2030, which is significantly faster than the population increase. And I will come back to some more contemporary figures later on in the presentation. But in carrying out the national transport planning proposal for the plan that is now valid, the established forecasting models for transport were deemed insufficient to answer questions from the government, but still other forms of knowledge in order to answer those questions were rejected in the process. The government namely requested an alternative climate prognosis, which would consider additional policy and measures to mitigate climate emissions in a cost-efficient way. So not only carrying out a base prognosis, but also a climate prognosis or scenario to achieve the targets. The forecasting model was, though, deemed too complex, and a climate scenario could not be modeled with the ordinary practices due to time constraints. They take a lot of time to run due to lack of data, that the alternatives had not been specified enough in order to be able to run in the models, and due to that models are not apt to handle larger system changes. They are, so to say, prepared to study quite small changes to the transport system, but not systematic changes in order to achieve transport policy objectives, for example. The Swedish Transport Administration, though, put forth an alternative target-oriented backcasting scenario, which was developed but later not published. And it was withdrawn by the Swedish Transport Administration, motivated by what they deemed uncertain potentials of several policy measures. For example, measures which could affect travel demand, so-called transport efficiency measures. Instead, the Swedish Transport Administration concluded that a climate scenario based on economic policy measures, extensive introduction of biofuels, that combination was seen to be able to be consistent with the base prognosis while also achieving the climate mitigation targets. So assumptions were made that no changes would have to be made to the travel demand of the future in order to achieve the climate mitigation targets. There was a line of thought presented in the plan which stated that with these assumptions of strong introduction of biofuels and economic policy measures, the future driving costs of cars could be assessed to be unchanged. Thereby, the future travel demand, according to the forecast, would not change. And therefore, the planned priorities of investments would not have to be changed either in order to achieve the climate mitigation targets. So this is an example of how the established analytical tools and knowledge perspective defined which knowledge in the process that was accepted. For example, uncertainties on biofuels were accepted, but not uncertainties regarding transport efficiency measures and possibilities of affecting future travel demand. Some quotes from respondents may illustrate this. One respondent stated that for the prognosis, a very formalistic structure has been established in planning practice. It has gained quite large influence over what kind of knowledge that can be presented and when. And this is interesting as the government put forth specific questions of exploring alternative futures, but the Transport Administration stated that they didn't have the capability or capacity to answer those questions. When the directives arrive, we have normally carried out most of the analysis already, one respondent stated, as these processes take so much time, the models take so much time to prepare and run. Another respondent responsible for the climate mitigation scenario stated that, Lisa, we produce climate scenarios and carry out research, but it doesn't come to use until, so to say, it is included in the prognosis, it seems. One respondent working with the traditional ways of assessing future travel development stated that it was a burning issue to question those types of transport efficiency measures, both how likely it was that they would be implemented, if they could be so far-reaching as described in the backcasting scenario, and their effects. That work had been carried out rather isolated from the prognosis work. The thoughts had never been verified in any form of model. And here you see that respondents refer to the specific models that are usually applied in transport planning when considering these questions, that the dominant models, so to say, define what is valid knowledge. One respondent stated that when it comes to transport efficiency, it is much wishful thinking. A second point when it comes to the National Investment Plan is that the climate impact of infrastructure planning is generally portrayed as irrelevant. So infrastructure investments, which investments that are made are claimed to be generally irrelevant for climate mitigation. One way of presenting this in the plan is that the aggregation of emission numbers at the national total level. The aggregation of emission numbers downplays the influence of new infrastructure. Recurrent statements are made that additional infrastructure has insignificant impact, as most infrastructure is already built. The aggregation of individual numbers into a total sum hides and evens out negative and positive impacts of the individual investments. And to take an example, the plan in total amounting to 600 billion kronor over 12 years is estimated to decrease emissions by infrastructure investments by a total of 1%. At the same time, the highway bypass Stockholm is expected by itself to increase emissions by 1%. And so-called stadsmiljöavtal or urban sustainability measures, which is a quite insignificant part of the plan, is expected to decrease emissions by 0.7%, almost amounting to the full effect of the whole plan, which shows that there are significant possibilities of having a stronger impact of infrastructure than is claimed by these aggregated numbers. Also, when presenting the plan, time and space constraints portray alternative measures to infrastructure investments as irrelevant. Measures for transport efficiency are deemed efficient on local and regional levels, but when taken in total at the national level, they are described as insignificant for climate mitigation. And potentials for transport efficiency measures are acknowledged in a longer time perspective, but not deemed relevant within the 12-year span of the plan. So we can conclude that alternatives to infrastructure investments are dismissed by reference to specific modeling understandings of a transport system, by aggregating numbers, by having a macro focus on the national level, and by applying a restricted time perspective in the planning process. Our macro projections have shown, one respondent stated, that new infrastructure has very little to do with climate mitigation and traffic flows. It's like scratching the surface of the gigantic transport apparatus. One cannot invest to achieve changes regarding climate. And here we see a quote which directly refers to the macro projections. So this statement is based on a specific model of the transport system and how that portrays these investments, so to say, and their effects. The result was like this. If we see the red line as a business as usual forecasted future increase in travel demand, the initial backcasting scenario aimed at achieving transport policy objectives, including the climate mitigation target, by including measures to decrease travel volumes. But when presented to the government, the scenarios were streamlined in a sense that showed that also achieving climate mitigation is in line with a continued strong increase in road traffic. No alternatives to increased road traffic was presented to the government, although the instruction from the government was to present alternatives. Some reflections regarding this first study then is that the established forecasting models contributed to sustaining a status quo of continued strong increases in road traffic by a combination of the three power expressions, you could say. First, a lacking capacity or relevance of the established models in exploring alternative future pathways. Secondly, by motivating to dismiss alternative knowledge perspectives and methods of analysis, for example, the backcasting, based on arguments of the uncertainty of the future, although the uncertainty of the base prognosis carried the same amount of uncertainty as the backcasting scenario. And thirdly, by also legitimating this lack of alternative future pathways and measures by claiming that transport efficiency measures don't have any potentials to significantly affect future travel demand, for example. And this results in somewhat of a catch-22, that measures are dismissed in the planning process, therefore they are not carried out in systematic ways, and therefore knowledge is not furthered or developed in order to be able to assess them in the plan. So the specific model understanding of the transport system in that sense becomes self-confirming, that it states that alternative measures will not impact the transport system, such measures are not carried out, and therefore they are not considered, as the transport modeling knowledge requires statistical data in order to be considered in transport planning. Having said that, I would also point out that within the Swedish Transport Administration, there are strong other perspectives, and especially at the regional levels, for example, in carrying out planning together with regions and municipal actors. but those perspectives are weakly mirrored in this specific strategic long-term planning process, which carries such strong influence over national transport policy in Sweden. Then we move on to the second study, which will show a different perspective on how to understand the potentials of transport efficiency measures and how to assess the uncertainties of the future. I have been studying the interagency collaboration for a fossil-free transformation of the transport system, in Sweden abbreviated SOFT. And here I have been studying the wider perspectives and assessments of potentials for transformation. This analysis is based on a forthcoming paper. It is published as a manuscript in my dissertation, and I've been carrying out this study together with my supervisors, Malin Henriksson, Maria Håkansson, and Caroline Isaksson. The SOFT process then, if I should call it that, was carried out between 2016 and 2020, quite much in parallel with the National Investment Plan that I talked about previously. But this process was independent from the established national transport planning and the established dominant practices within the Swedish Transport Administration. Rather, the government provided this commission to carry out this collaboration to the Swedish Energy Agency. And this put this work at somewhat of a distance from the dominant knowledge perspectives in transport planning. In this process, the Swedish Energy Agency strived for co-ownership of both how to carry out the process and the outcomes of the process with the 5 other national agencies involved, which were Trafikanalys, Transportstyrelsen, Boverket, Naturvårdsverket, och Trafikverket. And eventually, the 6 general directors of these agencies signed the central documents and deliberated on formulations in the planning documents which were prepared, which means that there was a strong consensus established regarding the perspectives of this process also at the level of general directors high up in the organizations. The participants that we interviewed expressed that this was a process characterized by joint dialogue and discussions, and I will get into that soon. And one conclusion of our work is that how the process was set up, how that process allowed for different planning practices and broader knowledge perspectives resulted in a stronger consideration of transport efficiency measures. So there seems to be a mutual dependency between how the process was laid out, the practices used, and the results of the process. An important part of the work initially was to establish a joint understanding of the situation, how to approach the future transport system in ways which mitigate climate emissions. The 6 agencies initially carried out a joint assessment of the current state of the transport system with regards to climate mitigation. The agencies focused on obstacles to transformation. What can the agencies do to lower the obstacles to transformation? And which mandates do these 6 agencies have? This provided for a common understanding of the situation, which was seen by respondents to be an important foundation for the continued work. Their initial work pointed at trends which currently develop in the wrong direction, and also they acknowledge the deep future uncertainties for meeting development. They also expressed and acknowledged the limited time available for transformation, and due to the uncertainty of the future developments, a need to spread the risks, so to say, not only focusing on, for example, improved vehicles and alternative fuels. So this motivated, based on this deliberation among the agencies, in a broad consideration of measures. Vehicles and fuels are important, but not in themselves sufficient due to risks and uncertainty. We also need to work with transport efficiency measures and step up that work. And the agencies eventually agreed on joint principles which should shape transformation. And this included, for example, focusing on accessibility rather than mobility, which differs quite significantly from the base prognosis that the Swedish Transport Administration prepared, for example, which is strongly focused on increased mobility as a value for society. It was also agreed that the transformation should continuously be monitored, evaluated, and adjusted, thereby somehow seeing their collaborative work as an ongoing process, not a one-time plan, which they agree on, but rather a continuous work. And that measures should be combined to allow for symbiosis, effects in symbiosis between different measures and measures which would positively affect several transport objectives and environmental objectives, for example. This also resulted in a more pragmatic approach to how to assess the future of the transport system and measures which possibly could influence the development of the transport system. It was jointly stated that the climate targets should be reached and favorably in a cost-efficient way. It was acknowledged that measures interrelate and are difficult to evaluate in isolation. And this also differs from conventional transport planning practices, which is focused on, for example, the economic benefits of one measure in isolation, which perhaps doesn't capture the system effects and interrelations in the transport system. It was agreed that assessments should be seen as indications of directions of effects rather than optimal calculations of effects, for example. And transformation was acknowledged as a changing process, as I said, due to the uncertainty and unknowability of the future. During this work, based on these principles, preliminary assessments based on professional experience and expertise of so-called tacit knowledge was accepted in the process. That 6 agencies agreed on measures and principles was seen as a quality mark, that although we lack data and due to the uncertain knowledge of effects of measures, that experts from 6 agencies agree was seen as one way of securing the quality of the work. It was stated still that although we make expert assessments, we should plan to reassess effects and evaluate and possibly change the plan and specific measures in the plan continuously in the future in order to make sure that we keep up the pace in the transformations. Some reflections regarding this process is that the process evidently seemed to have accommodated broader knowledge perspectives than in traditional transport planning, due to, for example, the detachment from the conventional national transport planning practice, that it was carried out at a distance from the conventional practice. Also due to the joint ownership of the process and outcomes, the will to really achieve a joint understanding, for example, of the situation and what can be done about it. There was provided great room for deliberation and negotiation to strive for consensus in the process and really discuss differing opinions or understandings of the situation. There seems to have been important, this initial analysis of the current situation and especially obstacles for transformation, focusing on the problems that are there today and visible, which need to be handled, and establishing common principles based on that understanding. And the approach to uncertainty and unknowability of the future seems to have been important, as it affected which assessment practices that were used. So assessments therefore came to consider the specific conditions at hand, that the climate mitigation target was more seen as a boundary condition than in conventional transport planning. And achieving climate mitigation requires a consideration of broad sets of measures. Uncertainty and unknowability motivates the continuous assessments rather than one-time assessments ex ante, so to say, before you implement measures. And the preliminary assessments in combination with continuous monitoring, evaluation, and adjustment was then prepared as a process in SOFT, rather than the idea of ostensible optimization beforehand. And I will go into the conclusions now, starting with a brief comparison between the national plan and the interagency collaboration. And this table is taken from my dissertation, which you can find at the KGH DIVA portal, if you're interested in that. First, perspectives differed when it came to what characterizes planning practices and knowledge perspectives in these processes. While the national plan utilized established so-called conventional assessment practices of forecasting and cost-benefit analysis, in SOFT, assessment practices were adapted to the issue at hand, climate mitigation of the transport system. While the national plan had marginalized knowledge perspectives beyond the transport economics and modeling, SOFT acknowledged broader professional knowledge perspectives and experiences. And when it came to the approach to future uncertainty and knowledge gaps, while the national plan had a limited exploration of uncertainty, and which required assessment to be based on specific modelable knowledge beforehand, which resulted in a catch-22, and unknown effects beforehand was seen as an argument for rejecting measures altogether. In SOFT, uncertainty was acknowledged as a basic planning condition, which resulted in an acceptance of preliminary expert-based tacit assessments in combination with continuous monitoring and evaluation, and resulted in that unknown effects beforehand was not an argument to reject them, but rather to consider broader categories of measures and combinations of measures. And this also affected the perceived scope and agency which was attributed to planning in order to be able to affect future travel demand, for example. In the national plan, future development was portrayed as mainly aligned with historic developments, a continuation of the historic development. But in SOFT, future development was rather perceived as an uncertain changing process with a wide span of potential outcomes. And while the national plan then resulted in a weak perception of the potential influence of planning, SOFT allowed a stronger perception of the potential influence of planning. I said that I would mention something about the new plan proposal for a new investment plan coming into effect in 2022. This is the latest traffic forecast for personal travel, which forms the foundation of that planning process, which states that car travel will increase by 27% during the period 2017 to 2040. And I think it's even higher numbers for goods transports in Sweden. Climate mitigation this time is assumed to be achieved and allow this traffic increase by strong electrification and utilization of biofuels, potentially also with some economic steering measures. But the potentials of affecting travel behaviors is not considered in this plan proposal, and I would state that it's argued more strongly than in the latest plan that there are no significant potentials in working with transport efficiency measures. So the planning process has, in my opinion, become more conservative this time than 4 years ago. What does this mean then? The influence of practice over prospects for transformation is what I'm concerned with. And I will conclude that understandings of the future and potentials for transformation depend to a great degree on specific planning practices and knowledge perspectives in planning. Practices of importance for which future pathways that are presented to politics and the general public. No practice which makes claims to describe the future is therefore value neutral. There are strong assumptions underpinning forecasts, for example, which makes them not value neutral, which is often expressed by the Swedish Transport Administration, for example, but rather they come with political consequences. Research has stated previously that changes in policy, for example, the introduction of climate policy in the transport system, requires that planning practices also are relevant in relation to such policy objectives in order for policy to gain influence over practice. And ultimately, seen from a Mistra SAMS perspective, for example, which is considering potentials of digitalized solutions to affect travel demand and travel behaviors. Ultimately, practices on the national level which lay out the future of the transport system affects how prospects of behavioral change, for example, sustainable digitalized accessibility solutions, are perceived and considered in transport policy and planning. So what is considered relevant practice and knowledge is therefore an issue in what I will claim need of debate beyond academia and planning professionals. It concerns politics and the general public in order to open out for or open up to consider different ways and pathways to achieve climate mitigation, which are now in some national planning processes closed down by specific practices and knowledge perspectives, while, for example, SOFT shows one way of how practice may open up for broader consideration of such measures. Yes, that was the last slide. Thank you for listening.